In the year 1665, in London, the busiest and most crowded capital of the British Empire, a nightmare from the Middle Ages awakened, claiming the lives of nearly 100,000 people in just over a year. It was not war, nor famine. The enemy was an invisible, brutal and mysterious entity, the Bubonic Plague. History calls it the Great Plague of London, but to those who lived through that terror it was the Plague Fiend. Welcome to Historical Truth, the YouTube channel for souls yearning to uncover historical truth, whether beautiful or brutal. Let us travel back in time to one of England's most horrific public health disasters. If you are moved, don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. The backdrop of the disaster was a 17th century London brimming with life, yet also harbouring the seeds of death. The city's population was around 460,000, crammed into narrow, dark and filthy streets. Garbage, animal carcasses and human waste clogged the streets and gutters. Rats and fleas thrived in this ideal environment. The city had just experienced an unusually warm winter, followed by a hot, stifling summer. Perfect conditions for disease to spread. Plague was no stranger to London. The city had suffered periodic outbreaks since the Black Death of the 14th century, but this time it would be far worse. The first signs were recorded in late 1664 and early 1665 in the suburb of St Giles in the Fields. Initially, just sporadic deaths. The plague doctors, those who risked their lives to care for the sick and record data, began noting a worrying increase. The mechanism of infection was completely misunderstood. People believed the disease spread through bad air, miasma, or as God's punishment, unaware of the bacterium Yersinia pestis and its intermediate host, fleas living on black rats. Preventive measures mainly involved lighting street fires to purify the air, fumigating with herbs, and praying. Then came the spring of 1665, and the fiend truly awoke. Infection rates skyrocketed. The signs of the disease became all too familiar and terrifying. High fever, chills, headache, and especially the painful swollen buboes in the groin, armpits, or neck, the mark of bubonic plague. Death often came swiftly and painfully within days. London began to sink into horror. As the hot summer of 1665 descended upon London, the Plague Fiend entered its most violent phase. In June, plague deaths recorded were 590. By July, that number soared to 6,337, and then reached its horrific peak in August with 159 deaths in a single month. To grasp the catastrophic scale, imagine nearly 8,000 Londoners dying from the plague each week. The city's air grew suffocating, not just from the heat, but from the stench of death and smoke from the ever-burning purification fires. The city authorities, under Lord Mayor Sir John Lawrence, tried to enforce medieval quarantine measures. One of the harshest decrees was issued. If one person in a household fell sick, the entire house would be sealed, locked shut for 40 days. A red cross and the words "Lord have mercy upon us" would be painted on the door as a warning of mourning. In theory, this aimed to contain the spread, but in practice, it was a collective death sentence, locking the healthy in with the sick, condemning them to wait for death in despair. The cries and pleas from inside the sealed houses became the haunting soundtrack of London that summer. Amidst the chaos and death, one figure emerged as the chronicler of the disaster, Samuel Pepys. His detailed, vivid diary entries have left posterity a terrifyingly realistic portrait of life in the plague city. On June 7th, Pepys wrote, "The plague is making us cruel as dogs to one another. I saw 2 or 3 houses in Drury Lane marked with a red cross." He described streets silent as the grave, grass growing wild on main thoroughfares from lack of traffic, and a constant sense of unease. To protect himself, Pepys carried a lump of ambergris in his pocket, hoping it would ward off the bad air. He also noted the rise of fortune-tellers, quacks, and bizarre remedies sold at exorbitant prices. While the wealthy and those with means fled London for the safety of the countryside, the poor had no choice but to stay and face the reaper. Shops closed, markets were deserted, church bells tolled incessantly for hasty funerals. The dead carts appeared at night, with drivers roaming the streets calling the familiar chilling refrain, "Bring out your dead." Mass graves, known as plague pits, were dug on the outskirts. In Aldgate, a massive pit over 50 feet long and 20 feet wide received more than 100 bodies. Contemporary accounts describe carts laden with corpses, piled atop each other like logs, being tipped into these communal graves without prayer or ceremony. Amid the eye of the death storm, London's plague-time society struggled to function through a crude, outdated administrative and medical machinery. The plague doctors became the most terrifying icons of the disaster. They were not formally trained physicians in the modern sense, but often tailors, cobblers, or quacks willing to risk their lives for high pay. Their costume was like something from a nightmare: a full-length waxed or leather gown, and a beaked mask filled with fragrant herbs, like rosemary, mint, cloves, believed to filter the poisonous air. They carried a long stick to examine patients from a distance and avoid touch. Their work was perilous and lonely. They entered infected houses to identify and record deaths, sometimes attempting treatments like bloodletting, applying poultices to swollen buboes, or administering strangely concocted potions. The mortality rate among these plague doctors was extremely high. They became pariahs, even while performing their duty. Their knock on a door signified bad news, and the sight of their dark cloaks on the street sent people fleeing in terror. Meanwhile, the church and religious faith became a final spiritual refuge, but also a site of increased infection risk. Congregational prayers continued, and these very gatherings became ideal breeding grounds for the disease. Many clergy stayed to comfort the sick and conduct burials, and they too died in large numbers. The prevailing view was that the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. Thus, fire and brimstone sermons about Judgment Day proliferated, and groups of penitents, reminiscent of medieval flagellants, sometimes appeared, self-flagellating in the streets hoping to appease divine wrath. However, not all was superstition and despair. A crucial step in recording and responding to the disaster was taken: the system of bills of mortality. These were weekly reports collected by searchers, usually elderly women, tasked with examining corpses and determining cause of death based on rudimentary symptoms. Though medically inaccurate, they often misattributed other deaths to plague. These bills were the only vital source of information for authorities and the public to gauge the scale of the outbreak. They were printed and widely distributed, becoming a horrific benchmark of the fiend's progress. It is from these documents that historians today can reconstruct the dramatic spike and decline of the death toll. By the autumn of 1665, London was a city under siege by death. An estimated 100,000 people, about a quarter of the population, had either died or fled. The once bustling central streets were eerily silent, marked only by the cawing of crows and the clatter of death cart wheels on cobblestones. The economy ground to a complete halt. Shops, theatres, and taverns were closed. Even the courts and Parliament had moved to Oxford. King Charles II and his court had evacuated early, leaving the city to grapple with its fate. Yet, it was in this darkest hour that stories of human compassion and resilience shone through. Not all with status and wealth fled. Some clergy, physicians, and local officials stayed, accepting the danger to maintain order and comfort the people. Plague nurses, often poor widows, were paid to tend to the sick in locked houses, a job with death as a constant companion. One of the deepest social impacts was the unravelling of family and community bonds. The fear of infection shattered the most basic ties. Parents abandoned sick children, children fled dying parents, neighbours avoided each other. There were even reports of people locked in houses under suspicion trying to escape, spreading the pestilence to new areas. Social order teetered on the brink of chaos. Looting and theft occurred in abandoned houses, and special patrols were formed to curb it. However, nature seemed to begin its intervention. September brought strong westerly winds, and more importantly, temperatures began to drop. Colder weather weakened the activity of the flea population, the primary vector. The death tolls recorded in the bills of mortality began to show a decline, from the peak of over 31,000 in August down to about 20,000 in September, and continuing downward. This was the first glimmer of hope after months of horror. But the Plague Fiend was not yet finished. It still claimed thousands of lives weekly. A new, equally gruesome problem arose: a severe shortage of coffins and gravediggers. The plague pits continued to expand. In Finsbury Fields, pits were dug up to 20 feet deep. Accounts describe corpses piled onto carts, and bodies often fell onto the streets, with no one daring to retrieve them. The exhausted city awaited a miracle, or at least a decisive change, and that change, once again, would come from another disaster. The miracle London awaited never came. Instead, a second disaster, even more terrifying and physically destructive, befell the plague-ravaged city, the Great Fire of London of 1666. Beginning in a small bakery on Pudding Lane near London Bridge, in the early hours of September 2nd, 1666, the fire ignited in dry conditions among houses made mostly of wood and thatch. Within hours, it became an uncontrollable firestorm. Paradoxically, for the Plague Fiend, this fire became a brutal purifier. As the flames consumed the city's core over 4 days and nights, they completely destroyed 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, including the old St. Paul's Cathedral, and most government buildings. More importantly, it burned down the worst slums, the narrow alleys, the rotten wooden houses, the ideal habitat for the black rats and disease-carrying fleas. The intense heat of the fire killed countless vectors and pathogens hiding in walls and floorboards. The direct aftermath of the fire was catastrophic. About 100,000 people were left homeless, but ironically, it created a new wave of migration, this time away from the worst plague zones. People fleeing the flames evacuated to suburbs, fields, and even across the Thames, further diluting population density, a key factor in disrupting the chain of transmission. After the Great Fire, plague death figures in the bills of mortality plummeted dramatically and clearly. In September 1666, the number was only 1,000, and by October, it fell to 843. Although small, sporadic outbreaks occurred later, the citywide pandemic was effectively over. Many contemporaries, including Samuel Pepys, saw the fire as a painful but necessary divine punishment, a purification by fire to save the city from a greater scourge. However, modern scientists and historians believe the primary reasons for the end of the 1665 plague were a combination of factors: colder weather reducing flea activity, developing natural immunity among survivors, and the fact that the most susceptible, the poor living in crowded, unsanitary conditions, had died in large numbers, depleting the host pool. The fire acted as a symbolic and physical full stop, destroying the disease's old habitat. Whatever the exact cause, the undeniable fact is, as the last smoke of the Great Fire cleared, the Plague Fiend gradually faded from London. It left behind a devastated city, a deeply traumatized society, and a huge question about the future. As the smoke of the Great Fire cleared and the Plague Fiend retreated, London faced a scene of dual destruction, a city ravaged by fire and a community eroded by death. The final estimated death toll for the 1665-1666 plague was horrific. Approximately 100,000 people in about 18 months, nearly 25% of the city's population at the time. This figure surpassed the human loss of any battle or disaster England faced that century. But the consequences went beyond numbers. London's social fabric was deeply warped. Trades and commerce lost a vast number of skilled workers and labourers. Thousands of children were orphaned, placing a heavy burden on nascent charities. The collective psyche was haunted by the fear of recurrence. Any rumour of a new case, however small, could spark panic and flight. Guilt and stigma against survivors or families of plague victims persisted for decades. Yet, from the ashes and pain, seeds of change and progress also began to sprout. The dual catastrophe forced England to fundamentally rethink urban planning, public health, and crisis management. 1. Physical reconstruction and urban planning. After the Great Fire, an ambitious reconstruction plan was proposed by architects like Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke. Although many ideas for grand boulevards and geometric layouts were not fully realised due to pressure for rapid rebuilding, a new set of building regulations was enacted. Wood and thatch were banned. Brick and stone became the primary materials. Streets were made wider, and sewer systems received more attention. The new London, at least in its centre, became more open, solid, and less flammable, and also a less hospitable environment for rat proliferation. 2. Public health awareness. Although the miasma, bad air theory, still dominated, the link between unsanitary living conditions, overcrowding, and disease spread became clearer than ever. Ideas of isolation and quarantine, however brutal, were seen as necessary. The need for a more accurate death recording system, bills of mortality, was also reinforced, laying groundwork for later demographic statistics. 3. The rise of science and reason. The 17th century was the age of the Enlightenment. The plague disaster occurred just as the Royal Society of London was newly founded. Scholars like Robert Boyle and others began approaching health and disease with observation and experimentation, gradually moving away from supernatural explanations. Although it would take nearly 200 more years for Yersinia pestis to be discovered, the shock of 1665 contributed to pushing scientific thinking in understanding disease causation. London did not learn its lesson immediately, but the events of 1665-1666 became an indelible landmark, a scar on the collective memory, forcing society to recognise its fragility before nature and begin a long journey toward better defence. The Plague Fiend of 1665 was not an isolated event, but the most painful chapter in a long and bloody relationship between Europe and bubonic plague. To fully grasp its scale and brutality, we must place it within a broader historical flow. London 1665 was essentially the last major outbreak of a plague cycle spanning centuries, beginning with the Black Death of 1347 to 1351. That pandemic killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population, an unprecedented demographic and social crisis. Thereafter, plague became endemic, returning periodically every 10-20 years to port cities and trade centres. The 17th century witnessed a series of other horrific plagues across Europe, making it a century of plague. The Plague of Milan, 1629-1631, killed about 280,000 in northern Italy, vividly depicted in Alessandro Manzoni's novel The Betrothed. The Plague of Seville, 1647-1652, ravaged southern Spain, claiming some 80,000 lives in that city alone, contributing to the decline of the Spanish Empire. The Plague of Vienna, 1679, killed at least 12,000, leading to the construction of the famous plague column, Pest Soil, as a thanksgiving for its end. The Plague of Marseille, 1720-1722, the last major outbreak in Western Europe occurring over 50 years after London, showing the long-lasting threat. Compared to these, the Great Plague of London, 1665, stands out not for having the highest mortality rate, Milan and the Black Death were worse, but for its detailed and vivid documentation. Thanks to Samuel Pepys' diary, the bills of mortality, and administrative records, we have an extremely concrete picture of the social, economic, and psychological impact of disease on an emerging modern city. It is a perfect case study of how a 17th century society, caught between superstition and science, confronted a biological catastrophe. Moreover, its timing is symbolic. It occurred just before the Great Fire of 1666, an event many saw as London's rebirth turning point. The combination of these two disasters created an epic narrative of destruction and reconstruction, of punishment and salvation, deeply ingrained in the English national consciousness. Finally, the London Plague of 1665 marked the end of an era. After it, although sporadic outbreaks persisted, bubonic plague gradually receded from Western and Northern Europe. The reasons are still debated, possibly the replacement of black rats, more favourable to disease-carrying fleas, by brown rats, improvements in housing and nutrition, climate change, or the evolution of the bacterium itself. Whatever the reason, London 1665 became the tragic final act of a 3-century-long drama, paving the way for a new era with different public health challenges. So, what is the legacy of the Plague Fiend of London of 1665? It is not merely death tolls carved into historical tombstones, but a multifaceted lesson that still resonates today. A legacy of remembrance and warning. Sites like the mass burial pit at Aldgate, or St. Ephraim Zest, Giles in the Fields Church, where it began, remain silent witnesses. The phrase, "bring out your dead," has entered popular culture as a symbol of brutality. The plague doctor's beaked mask costume is an unforgettable image of that dark period. It reminds us that despite all technological progress, humanity remains vulnerable to emerging pathogens, a lesson in crisis response. London's 1665 reaction was a mix of superstition, necessary cruelty, and rudimentary scientific effort. Measures of isolation, lockdown, and mortality recording, bills of mortality, however crude, laid the groundwork for later concepts of quarantine and epidemiology. It shows that even without understanding the cause, implementing physical interventions and collecting data can have an impact. Conversely, denial, chaotic flight, and misinformation worsen the outcome, a lesson still valid, a catalyst for change. As we saw, the dual catastrophe of 1665-1666 spurred urban reconstruction with sturdier materials, wider streets, and, inadvertently, a less disease-friendly environment. It contributed to the advancement of scientific and rational thought of the Enlightenment, seeking natural rather than supernatural explanations. London's pain planted seeds for modern public health. Looking back at the Plague Fiend of London, 1665, we don't just witness a historical tragedy. We see the destructive power of nature, the fragility of social structures, but also humanity's extraordinary resilience. London was not wiped out. It rose from the ashes of plague and fire to become a modern world metropolis. Thank you for joining Historical Truth. Journeys into the past always hold valuable lessons for the present. If the story of the Plague Fiend of London made you reflect, let us know what you think. Comment below on what impressed you most, or draw comparisons with pandemics in modern history. Subscribe to Historical Truth and hit the notification bell so you won't miss future journeys to uncover historical truths, from natural disasters and mysterious revolutions to human destinies that change the world. Share this video with fellow history enthusiasts. Together we keep these stories alive as both a reminder and an invaluable source of knowledge. History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Let's listen to those rhymes on Historical Truth.